I want to begin with a quotation which comes from a meeting of all of the ministers of education in ASEAN, APEC. And it says that the key competences of the 21st century are critical thinking, teamwork, and self-learning. Now that was a policy statement by education ministers who were, in a sense, reviewing their own country's performance in education and asking about the connection between education and societal development. So societal development somehow is connected with education in ways which are obviously very complex, but let's say that in all of the factors which cause development, and there might be a list of 20 such factors, one of the biggest and the most significant on the evidence we have is the form of education. And the logics that I see making more sense of it than anything else are that education produces a certain form of human capital, a set of capabilities in the individuals, which, if used properly and if designed properly when it's being input, produce a high level of social capital. Social capital is the ability to cooperate. And once you have that, you can then build an advanced economy, because if the society has a very high level of cooperativeness, it has a low cost of transaction. In other words, it can get high productivity out of people in work, it can get high efficiency in the exchange process of the economy. Now, there are many bits and pieces in the middle of all of this, but that's the essence of the argument, which says that education plays a major role, but not the only role, in societal progress. Now, if we take the case of Singapore compared to other societies in the region, it stands along with Hong Kong as being a city-state, which gives it one advantage above most other societies around, and that is that it is fundamentally manageable. In other words, you can have quite strong government and you can get things done. It's the difference between running a village and running a major metropolis. It's much easier to run a village. Now, Singapore had the accident historically of having inherited already a fairly advanced administration system, and ethnically a very large balance of Chinese people in its makeup, which brought together two civilizations which happened to be complementary to each other. The Confucian ideal of scholarship and administration and public duty was close to the Western ideal of what in England is called the Whitehall Mandarins, the same ideal, that you have a professional civil service that cares for the good of the society and cares for the ideals of progress. So, both Hong Kong and Singapore, in their own ways, were very well administered, very professionally administered, and that stands in sharp contrast historically with many of the surrounding countries which struggled for decades to achieve that, and some of them still have not done so. Okay, once Singapore had become independent as a state and had a strong government able to do things and a strong set of ideals about incorruptibility, progress, etc., it set about finding a policy for development and took account of the fact that it had very few resources except its people. It had no technology, it had no natural resources to speak of, but it had a magical location, and it had a whole large set of people who could be trained. So it established a development policy which was based upon attracting multinationals who would bring in capital and technology and access to foreign markets. They needed labor. And the first stage of the development of Singapore was to provide them with skilled labor. Over time, that graduated to supplying them with skilled labor and highly intelligent labor. And that is where we are today. That the education system of Singapore was designed specifically to provide Singapore industry with the right kind of labor and to upgrade it over time until we now have the knowledge society, which Singapore is built around, and a very high level of output of people with what the Singapore government decides is the right knowledge. Now, that means that the education system of Singapore is an instrument of state policy. It works, so one could say it's a highly benevolent instrument. And it's also an instrument which is capable of adaptation over time, so it's not designed by people who are blind. One of the examples of that adaptation is about 20 years ago, when it became apparent that there was not enough creativity in the education system. There was not enough, there was too much rote learning, too much memorizing, the classic dilemma of much Asian education, that it was teacher-centered and memory-centered. And the Singapore government set out very firmly to try to break that, starting with the schools, with new forms of teaching, new forms of learning process, and that experimentation has gone on until nowadays. If you go into a typical Singapore school, you find a great deal of emphasis on self-expression, on creativity, on individualism, and a downplaying of the strength of the teacher as authority. Very interesting process. Now, more recently, a second development, which is an extension of that, is showing up in new forms of higher education, which progress from the experimentation at the lower level in what's called PBL, project-based learning, or participant-based learning, in which the role of the teacher is that of provider of scaffolding for learning and encourager of curiosity. And that is now a matter of obviously strong commitment on the part of the Ministry of Education. There's an entire university devoted to it, and most of the higher education institutions are at least experimenting with it and watching what's going on in the rest of the world with this. I wouldn't call it a new process, but an innovative process in the Asian context. Okay, let's consider the contrasts in the region between the highly reputable universities and roll into our consideration the question of central government control versus individual university autonomy, because there is a pattern which is intriguing here. In a general sense, the leaving of the university with freedom to make its own way, to be autonomous, to have its own policies, to be a genuinely free academic institution is associated with success. And the recent UNESCO study of universities worldwide has confirmed that. At the same time, you do have in Singapore quite a tight degree of interaction between the government and the university, so that one could argue that there isn't as much autonomy as you get in the case of Hong Kong, where the universities are very autonomous from the government and have much greater discretion over what they do. So when we look at the recent rankings of Asian universities, Hong Kong provides numbers 1, 2, and 5, and NUS produces number 3. None of the other universities in Singapore are in that very, very high category. So one has to raise the question, why is Hong Kong doing better according to this ranking? Even though such rankings are controversial, there's still a matter of principle here. And you find that in other societies where the ratings are fairly low, you do tend to get a low level of university autonomy and a high level of dependence on government funding, and one could assume some degree of interference by the government in what is happening in the university. The case of Malaysia is very clear in that regard, and I think also many of the universities in other parts of the regions, particularly Japan and China, are examples of that happening. So the question of the universities being autonomous bodies which can make up their own minds about how they do things is a very important factor influencing the eventual perceived quality of the output and the research and reputation of the institution. I think there's room here for a government to do some reflection on what is the best state of affairs between governments and universities, and how that very, very delicate balance should best be managed.